The stagecoach groaned to a stop, its tired leather sighing in the sudden quiet. For 3 weeks, the rattle and sway of its wheels had been the only constant in Clara Jane Rowe's life, a relentless rhythm churning dust and miles into a bleak, uncertain future. Now, the silence that fell was heavier than the journey itself. She waited a moment, her hands clutching the worn fabric of her reticule, before the driver swung open the door, letting in a blast of cold, thin air that smelled of dirt and distance. "Dry willow, ma'am," he grunted, not meeting her eye. Clara stepped down onto what could hardly be called a street. It was more a suggestion of one. A wide, rutted track of pale dirt that ran between a handful of buildings clinging to the vast, empty land. There was a mercantile with a faded sign, a saloon whose doors were shut tight against the afternoon chill, and a blacksmith's forge, the smoke from its chimney rising straight and gray into a sky the color of slate. The wind, a constant presence on the high plains, whipped at the hem of her traveling dress, its fabric thin and weary from the long passage. She pulled her shawl tighter, her gaze sweeping over the desolate town, searching, and then she saw him. He stood by a buckboard wagon, a tall man made taller by the stark emptiness surrounding him. He was as still as the low, rolling hills that stretched out to the horizon, a figure carved from the very landscape he inhabited. A battered felt hat was pulled low over his brow, shadowing a face she couldn't yet read. His coat was worn at the elbows and shoulders, the dark wool faded by sun and work. He did not move, did not call her name. He simply waited, watching her. This was him, then Eli Carver, her husband-to-be. A shiver, born of something other than the cold, traced its way down her spine. She had expected a man, of course, a rancher, but she had pictured someone different. Perhaps a man whose loneliness made him eager, or whose desperation made him rough. She had prepared herself for either. She was not prepared for this profound, unnerving silence. It felt like a judgment. The driver hauled her single trunk from the back of the coach and dropped it in the dust with a thud that seemed to echo in the stillness. Clara walked toward the waiting man, each step an effort, the heels of her worn boots sinking into the soft dirt. Her hands, chapped and raw from the dry air, felt impossibly clumsy. She stopped a few feet from him, her throat tight. His eyes, when he finally lifted his head enough for her to see them, were the color of the winter sky, a pale, clear gray. They held no warmth, but no cruelty either. They simply looked, taking in her worn dress, the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the faint tremor in her hands. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "Miss Rowe," he said. His voice was deeper than she'd imagined, low and quiet, like stones rubbing together at the bottom of a river. It was not a voice for idle talk. "Mr. Carver?" she replied, her own voice a thin whisper she hardly recognized. He reached not for her, but for her trunk, lifting it with an easy strength that made the heavy wooden box seem weightless. He placed it in the back of the wagon and then turned to her, gesturing toward the seat with one large, calloused hand. The gesture was a trigger, a key turning a lock in her memory. Another hand, so very different, flashed in her mind's eye, smooth, pale, a gold signet ring on its smallest finger. The world of Dry Willow, Montana, dissolved, replaced by the soft, gaslit glow of a St. Louis parlor. Rain whispered against the tall glass windows, and the air smelled of beeswax and roses. She was wearing silk, a pale blue that Arthur had said matched her eyes. Arthur Penhaligon. His name itself had sounded like wealth, like security, like everything she had ever been told a woman should want. He had been handsome, with a smile that was quick and charming, but his eyes were the eyes of a merchant, always calculating, always assessing value. She had been, for a time, a valuable asset. Her father was a respectable man, if not a wealthy one, and she was pretty, poised, and skilled in all the quiet arts of running a grand household. Their engagement was a sensible arrangement, a merger of his fortune and her grace. She had even allowed herself to believe it was love. Then came the fall. A misplaced step on the polished staircase, a sudden, sharp cry, and a world that tilted into a dizzying spiral of pain and blood. The weeks that followed were a blur of fevered dreams and the cloying scent of carbolic acid. The doctor, a grim man with spectacles perched on his nose, had spoken in hushed tones to Arthur in the hallway. Words drifted to her through the haze of her sickbed. "Infection, a terrible fever. She is lucky to be alive." When the fever finally broke, she was left weak and empty, a hollowed-out version of the woman she had been. But the true emptiness, the one that would define her, was yet to be revealed. It was the doctor who told her, his gaze fixed on a point just over her shoulder. The damage from the infection was severe. He explained, there would be no children. The words were clinical, a diagnosis delivered with a detached pity that was worse than any condemnation. Her womb, he said, was a barren field. She had told Arthur that evening, her voice trembling as she relayed the doctor's verdict. He listened without expression, his handsome face a mask of polite concern. He patted her hand, the one that wore his diamond ring. "You must rest, my dear," he'd said. "Do not trouble yourself with this now." But the trouble had already taken root. The next day, his visits became shorter. The day after, he sent a note with his footman. Within a week, the whispers started among the servants, the sideways glances from the society ladies she had once called friends. He was a man who needed an heir, they murmured. A legacy was paramount. A wife's first duty was to her husband's line. The end came not in a heated argument or a tearful confrontation, but in a letter, delivered on his family's heavy, cream-colored stationery. It was a masterpiece of cold, corporate regret. He spoke of unfortunate circumstances, of changed realities, of the dissolution of their mutual agreement. He wished her well, as one might wish a former business partner well after a failed venture. The diamond ring was to be returned to his solicitor. She was no longer a suitable bride. She was damaged goods, a broken vessel. The shame was a physical thing, a heavy cloak that smothered her. Her father, a man who prized reputation above all else, could barely look at her. It was he who had seen the advertisement in a gazette, the one from a rancher in Montana seeking a wife. It was a quiet, efficient way to dispose of a daughter who had become an embarrassment. And so she had been packaged up and shipped west, a piece of unwanted cargo. Her true condition a secret shame buried deep within her. "Miss Rowe?" Eli Carver's voice pulled her from the rain-slicked streets of St. Louis back to the dusty track of Dry Willow. He was standing by the wagon, waiting. The memory had taken only a second, but it had left her chilled to the bone. She nodded, allowing him to help her up onto the hard wooden seat of the buckboard. His touch was brief and impersonal, his hand firm on her elbow, then gone. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. The ride to his ranch was conducted in the same thick silence that had greeted her. The tension was a living thing between them. A third passenger on the wagon seat. He did not ask about her journey. She did not ask about his ranch. The silence was a chasm, and Clara did not know how to cross it. She was afraid that if she spoke, the truth of her inadequacy would spill out, and he would turn the wagon around and leave her right there in the dust. As they left the small cluster of buildings behind, the land opened up into a breathtaking, terrifying emptiness. There were no trees to soften the horizon, only the endless sweep of pale, winter-bleached grass and the dark, jagged lines of distant buttes. The sky was a wide, empty plate, vast and indifferent. This was a land that did not offer comfort. It demanded resilience, a toughness she was terrifyingly sure she did not possess. A few flakes of snow, tiny and sharp as bits of glass, began to fall. They did not drift. They were driven by the wind, stinging her cheeks. She watched how Eli Carver seemed to be a part of it all. He did not flinch from the wind or the cold. He sat straight-backed, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his hands steady on the reins. He belonged here. She was an intruder, a fragile piece of porcelain set down in a world of stone and iron. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was even more isolated than she had imagined. It stood alone in a slight depression of the land, a small, solid structure of dark, weathered logs, with a stone chimney at one end. A curl of smoke rose from it, the only sign of warmth in the entire landscape. There was a barn, equally stark, and a series of fenced-in areas, all of them empty. He pulled the wagon to a stop and was down before she could move. He came around to her side, and again, he offered his hand. This time, she hesitated for only a moment before placing her gloved fingers in his palm. His hand was rough and hard, the skin calloused from work, but his grip was surprisingly gentle as he helped her down. Inside, the cabin was a single room, larger than she'd expected but spare in its furnishings, and it was clean, impeccably so. The floorboards were swept, the stone hearth was free of old ash, and a neat stack of firewood sat beside it. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A cast-iron stove was in one corner, and shelves holding a few tins and sacks of flour were against the far wall. There was one proper bed, a wooden frame with a rope-strung base and what looked like a thick feather mattress, covered with a neatly patched quilt. He brought her trunk in and set it at the foot of that bed. "This will be yours," he said, gesturing to the bed. Clara looked from the bed to the cold, empty hearth. "And you, Mr. Carver?" He picked up a thick, rough-spun blanket from a nearby peg. "The hearth will do for me." He said it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He stoked the fire, adding a log from the pile. Flames licked up, casting a warm, dancing light across the room and chasing some of the gloom from the corners. He moved with a quiet efficiency, making no unnecessary motions, wasting no words. He made a pot of coffee, the smell rich and comforting in the small space, and handed her a tin mug of the steaming black liquid. She took it, her fingers wrapping around the welcome heat. She was utterly bewildered. She had braced herself for a curt welcome, for a man who would make his demands clear from the first night. She had expected coldness, perhaps even a brusque assertion of his rights as the man who had paid her passage. She had not expected this gentle restraint, this quiet, unassuming decency. It was more disarming than any cruelty. It made her feel like a fraud. He was treating her with a respect she did not feel she deserved, offering her the best of what little he had, and he did not even know the full, bitter truth of her. The first few days passed in a strange, silent routine. Eli rose before the sun. The scrape of his boots on the floorboards, the first sound she'd hear. He would be gone for hours, tending to whatever work a rancher did in the gray beginnings of winter. Clara was left alone in the crushing silence of the cabin, the howl of the wind her only companion. She tried to make herself useful, to earn her keep. She unpacked her trunk, arranging her few meager belongings. She cleaned what was already clean. She mended a small tear in one of his shirts, her stitches small and perfect, a relic of a life where such skills had mattered. But her body was a traitor. The long journey and the lingering weakness from her illness had left her with no reserves. The air was too thin, the cold too deep. A constant exhaustion settled in her bones. At night, sleep offered no respite. The nightmares came, fragments of her past life rising up to haunt her. She would see Arthur's face, his lips curling in disdain. She would hear the doctor's solemn pronouncement, the words "barren field" echoing in her mind. She would feel herself falling, endlessly falling. She always woke with a soft, choked cry, her face wet with tears in the cold darkness of the cabin. She would lie still, her heart pounding, listening to the steady, quiet breathing of the man sleeping by the fire, terrified she had woken him. He never gave any sign that he heard, but one morning, after a particularly bad night, she woke to find a mug of hot, sweet tea on the small crate he'd placed beside her bed. Steam rose from it in a fragile column. He was already outside, the cabin empty but for her. He hadn't asked. He hadn't pried. He had simply noticed her pain and offered a small, silent comfort. The unspoken kindness made her want to weep. They did not speak of why she was truly there. The pretense of a mail-order bride was a thin veil over the raw truth of her situation. He was a man in need of a wife, and a wife was expected to provide children, heirs to work the land and carry on a name. It was the fundamental contract of their arrangement, and she knew she could not fulfill her end of it. The unspoken truth hung between them, as vast and empty as the Montana sky. She felt she had to do more, to prove her worth in other ways. She found a small, protected patch of earth near the cabin that had once been a garden. The ground was hard and cold, but she spent an afternoon turning it over with a rusty spade, her breath pluming in the air. She found an axe by the woodpile. The logs were thick, the axe heavy in her unaccustomed hands. She had to try. She had to show him she was not useless, not entirely broken. She swung the axe, the force of the blow jarring her arms. A few splinters flew. She swung again, gritting her teeth, pouring all her fear and shame into the motion. A wave of dizziness washed over her. The gray sky seemed to tilt and swim. The axe felt impossibly heavy, as if it were chained to the ground. Her arms gave out, her legs buckled, and the world dissolved into a silent, rushing darkness. When she came to, she was being lifted. Strong arms were around her, cradling her against a solid chest that smelled of pine and cold air. She looked up into Eli Carver's face. His expression was unreadable, but his gray eyes were fixed on her, a flicker of something, concern, perhaps, in their depths. He held her as if she weighed nothing at all. He carried her back to the cabin, his long strides sure and steady. The warmth of the cabin enveloped them. He did not speak as he laid her gently on the bed, pulling the patched quilt up to her chin. And in that moment, something inside her broke. The carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart crumbled into dust. A quiet, hopeless sob escaped her lips. She turned her face into the pillow, and the tears she had held back for so long finally came. A silent, scalding flood of grief for the life she had lost, the children she would never hold, the woman she could never be. He stood by the bed for a long moment, a dark, silent shape in the dim light. Then, without a word, he turned and went back outside. That night, the wind howled around the small cabin, a lonely, mournful sound. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing orange embers. She lay awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, the weight of her deception a crushing burden on her soul. She could not bear his quiet kindness for another day, not while this lie festered between them. He lay on his blanket by the hearth, his back to her. She did not know if he was asleep or awake. It didn't matter. She had to say it. The words had to be released, or they would choke her. "I can't give you what other women can," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. It was a confession, a plea, and a final, desperate admission of her own worthlessness. She waited for his response, for the cold dismissal, for the anger he was so entitled to feel. The silence stretched on, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire. Then, his voice came out of the darkness, low and steady, without a trace of pity or surprise. He did not turn. He did not move. "Then be my only one." His words, spoken into the dark, did not magically mend the broken places inside her, but they laid a strange and unexpected balm upon them. "Then be my only one." It was not a declaration of love, nor a promise of happiness. It was simpler, and perhaps more profound. It was an acceptance. He had heard her deepest shame, and he had not turned her away. In the days that followed, the confession, once spoken, settled into the silence between them. not as a source of tension, but as a known truth, a stone laid bare that they no longer had to stumble over in the dark. Life on the ranch fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. It was a hard, unyielding existence that demanded everything and offered little in return but the satisfaction of survival. Eli worked with a relentless, quiet energy that seemed to draw strength from the very land that tried to break him. He rose in the pre-dawn chill, his movements economical and sure as he mended fences that the wind constantly tested, tended to the small herd of cattle that was his livelihood, and chopped endless cords of wood in preparation for the winter that was already breathing down their necks. He was a man made of sinew and silence, his body a testament to a life of ceaseless labor. Clara, in turn, fought her own battle against the land and the weakness of her own body. She found she had a small, fierce core of stubbornness she hadn't known she possessed, though exhaustion was a constant companion, a dull ache in her bones. She refused to surrender to it. She learned to bake bread that was dense and nourishing, to make a thin but savory stew from dried meat and winter vegetables, to scrub the floorboards with a lye soap that reddened her hands but satisfied her soul. She claimed the inside of the cabin as her domain, a small pocket of warmth and order carved out of the vast, chaotic wilderness outside. Their connection, which had begun in a silence born of uncertainty, began to transform. It deepened not in conversation, but in the small, unspoken gestures of two people sharing a difficult life. It was in the way she would take his coat when he came in from the cold, his shoulders dusted with snow, and hang it by the fire to dry. It was in the way he noticed her boots were worn through at the sole, and, one evening, sat by the hearth with a leather needle and waxed thread, methodically stitching a new sole into place without a word being exchanged. One afternoon, as he returned from the far pasture, she met him at the door. A smudge of dark earth was caked on his cheek, just below his eye. Before she could think, she reached up with the corner of her apron and gently brushed it away. Her fingers grazed his skin, rough with stubble and chilled by the wind. He froze for a heartbeat, his gray eyes fixed on hers. In their depths, she saw a flicker of something she couldn't name, surprise, confusion, perhaps something more. He did not pull away. The moment stretched, charged with a strange and potent energy, before she dropped her hand, her own cheeks suddenly warm. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod and moved past her into the cabin. That evening, feeling a restlessness she couldn't quell, Clara rummaged through her trunk until her fingers found the small, leather-bound journal she had carried from St. Louis. She hadn't opened it since her arrival. What was there to say? But now, words began to bubble up inside her, a spring unstopped. She sat at the small table, the cabin quiet but for the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind, and by the flickering lamplight, she wrote, October 12th, 1882, she began, her pen scratching across the page. The silence here is different than any I have known. It is not an absence of sound, but a presence. It is in the vastness of the sky and the stillness of the hills. It is inside this cabin. It is inside him. I used to think his quiet was a judgment on me, but I am no longer certain. His silence is not empty. It is solid. He mended my boots today. My old life feels like a dream I once had, a story about another person. The journal became her confidant, the only place she could voice the turmoil of her heart. She wrote of the crushing loneliness of the plains, of the fear that gnawed at her in the long, dark nights. And she wrote of Eli Carver. She wrote of his hands, calloused and capable. She wrote of his strength, an unshowy power that was part of his very being. And she wrote of his decency, a quiet, steady quality that continued to confound and humble her. She was a woman who had been discarded for what she lacked, yet this man, who knew her lack, treated her not as a burden, but as a partner in the simple, brutal business of living. A month after her arrival, the need for supplies became urgent. The first heavy snows had already dusted the high country, a warning that the window for travel was closing. Eli announced his intention to go to Dry Willow one morning over breakfast. "We need flour," he said, "and salt, and coffee." He looked at her across the table. "You can come, if you've a mind to." A part of her shrank from the idea of facing the town, of seeing other people, of feeling their eyes upon her. But another part of her, the part that had begun to grow in the quiet of the cabin, longed for a glimpse of another world, however small and desolate. "I will come," she said. The trip into town was as silent as their first ride from it, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer a tense, brittle thing, but something more comfortable, a shared space that no longer needed to be filled with words. When they arrived, Dry Willow looked just as bleak as she remembered. A few more horses were tied to the hitching posts, and a thin plume of smoke rose from the blacksmith's forge. But the same air of isolation hung over everything. Eli helped her down from the wagon, and for the first time, he did not immediately release her arm. He kept a light but steadying hand on her elbow as they walked toward the mercantile. The gesture was small, but it felt like an anchor in the sudden swirl of anxiety she felt. The moment they stepped through the door, a little bell jangling above them, she felt the change. The low murmur of conversation among the half-dozen patrons faltered. Every eye in the store turned to them. To her, she could feel their gazes, sharp and curious, picking at the worn fabric of her dress, at the paleness of her face. The women, in particular, stared with a cold, assessing curiosity. They looked from her to the tall, silent man beside her, and whispers, like the rustle of dry leaves, began to stir in the corners of the room. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the rough-hewn floorboards, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Eli seemed oblivious to the stares, his face as impassive as ever. He moved to the counter and began his business with the proprietor, a balding man with a perpetually sour expression. Clara, feeling stranded, made her way to a display of sewing notions, pretending an interest in spools of thread she did not need. A young man, little more than a boy, was working as a clerk, stocking shelves with tins of peaches. As she passed him, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. A look of recognition, or perhaps something else, flickered in his face before he quickly looked away, his cheeks coloring as if he'd been caught in some transgression. He refused to meet her gaze again. The small, public shunning was like a slap. It was then that she heard a voice, sharp and cultured, a sound as out of place in this dusty mercantile as a shard of fine porcelain in a pigsty. "Clara Jane Rowe, is that truly you?" Clara froze, her back to the voice. She knew it instantly. The carefully modulated tones, the faint, condescending lilt. It was the voice of Mrs. Beatrice Albright, the wife of a prominent St. Louis physician, a woman who had been a frequent guest in the Penhaligon home, a woman who thrived on gossip as a plant thrives on water. Slowly, Clara turned. Beatrice Albright stood near a barrel of pickles, dressed in a traveling costume of dark green wool that was far too fine for Dry Willow. Her face was a mask of feigned, delighted surprise. "My dear child, what on earth are you doing in this rustic place?" she asked, her voice carrying through the suddenly silent store. "I'm Mrs. Albright," Clara said, her own voice barely a whisper. I live here now." "You live here?" Beatrice's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose in theatrical disbelief. She let her gaze travel pointedly to Eli, who had turned from the counter and was now watching them, his expression unreadable. "With him?" The implication was clear. How could a woman of her breeding, a woman once engaged to the likes of Arthur Penhaligon, end up in the middle of nowhere with a rough-looking rancher? "This is my husband, Mr. Carver," Clara managed to say, the word husband feeling strange and untrue on her tongue. Beatrice Albright let out a small, delicate laugh. "Oh, my dear, what a turn of events." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was, perversely, louder than her normal tone. "After all that unpleasantness in St. Louis, the unfortunate condition that came to light, I must say, you are brave to start anew. Very brave." Every word was a poisoned dart. The word condition hung in the air, ripe with insinuation. The whispers in the store grew louder, more confident. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Eli moved to her side. He did not touch her, but his presence was a solid wall. He looked at Beatrice Albright, his gray eyes cold and flat as river stones. "Our business is concluded," he said to the proprietor. He paid for their supplies, his movements calm and deliberate. And then, with a firm hand on Clara's back, he guided her out of the store, away from the suffocating weight of the stairs and whispers. The ride back to the ranch was shrouded in a new kind of silence. It was the old, tense silence from her first day, but now it was laced with the fresh poison of shame. She had brought her disgrace to his doorstep. She had tainted his name in the town. He did not speak, and she could not. What could she say? The truth was out, a festering wound exposed to the cold, harsh air. That evening, Eli went into town alone. He said he needed to see the blacksmith about a new shoe for one of the horses, but Clara knew it was more than that. She watched him ride away, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. He was gone for hours. Darkness fell, and the wind began to howl, a lonely, keening sound that echoed the emptiness in her heart. She sat by the fire, her mending lying forgotten in her lap, her ears straining for the sound of his horse. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats, every creak of the cabin like the door opening. When he finally returned, well after midnight, the moment she saw him, she knew something was wrong. He moved with a stiff, controlled motion. There was a dark, purplish bruise swelling on his cheekbone, and the knuckles of his right hand were split and bloody. He said nothing as he entered, moving directly to the wash basin to splash cold water on his face and hands. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He did not look at her. "Nothing," he said, his voice flat. But it wasn't nothing. She knew it. The whispers in the store had festered. They had followed him from the mercantile to the saloon. The seed of gossip planted by Beatrice Albright had taken root and grown into something ugly and cruel. And she was right. What she did not know was the specifics. She did not know that Eli had been standing at the saloon bar, nursing a single whiskey. When he heard them, a group of men, their tongues loosened by drink, were talking. He heard her name. He heard the words St. Louis Society, and then he heard a man with a wheezing laugh say something about a man needing a son and a woman who was nothing but barren ground. Another man had chimed in, his voice thick and slurred, calling her damaged goods. Eli had turned slowly, his face devoid of expression. He had looked at the man who had spoken, a loudmouthed drifter named Silas Black. He had walked over, and without a word, he had hit him. It was one punch, a single, explosive release of a cold, contained fury. The sound of it had cracked through the saloon's noisy din, followed by the sickening crunch of breaking bone. Silas Black had gone down like a felled tree, blood pouring from his shattered nose. Eli had turned and walked out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. He told her none of this. He simply bandaged his hand with a strip of clean linen and sat down by the fire, his back to her, a wall of silence between them more formidable than ever. The shame was more than Clara could bear. She had fled St. Louis to escape it, but it had followed her, a relentless shadow, and now she had drawn this good, quiet man into its darkness. She had caused him to be bloodied and bruised, to become the subject of talk and speculation. She was a blight, a curse. Before the first hint of dawn colored the eastern sky, she made her decision. She moved in the near darkness, her motions quiet and furtive. She packed her few belongings into a small satchel, her journal, a change of clothes, the last of the money her father had given her. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to get her to another town, another place where no one knew her name. Leaving was the only kindness she could offer him now. It was the only way to repay him for his decency. She was pulling on her shawl, her hand on the cabin door's latch, when a hand closed around her wrist. She gasped, whirling around. Eli stood behind her, a tall shadow in the gray gloom. He was dressed, though she hadn't heard him rise. He must have been awake the whole time, watching her. His grip was not rough, but it was unyielding. His fingers were trembling, or perhaps it was her own wrist that trembled. She couldn't tell. "Let me go," she whispered, pulling against his grip. He did not release her. He simply stood there, his eyes searching her face in the dim light. The sight of his bruised cheek, of his quiet, implacable presence, broke something inside her. All the fear, the shame, the bitter, hopeless grief she had carried for so long erupted in a torrent of furious, painful words. You should let me go," she cried, her voice cracking, no longer a whisper. "You heard them. You heard what they say. It's true, all of it. I am nothing. I have brought my shame to your home and made you fight for a woman who is not worth fighting for. You should have a real wife, Eli, a whole woman, one who can give you children." The words hung in the cold air, a raw, ragged testament to her own self-loathing. She was half sobbing now, trying to wrench her wrist from his grasp. She expected him to let go, to turn away in disgust. Instead, for the first time since she had met him, his silence broke. His voice, when it came, was raw, torn from a place deep inside him. It was a voice she had never heard before, rough with a pain so old and so deep it seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. "My wife," he said, his grip tightening on her wrist, "died in that bed." He nodded toward the bed where she'd been sleeping, the bed he had given her. She died giving birth. So did the baby, a little girl. He took a ragged breath, his gaze locked with hers, and in his eyes she saw a world of grief she could not have imagined. "I've had enough of blood and crying to last a lifetime." The confession struck her with the force of a physical blow. All the air left her lungs. His silence, his restraint, his strange, gentle kindness, it all fell into place. It was not about her. It was about him. It was about the ghost that haunted this small cabin, the memory of a tragedy so profound it had scoured him clean of all expectations. Her own grief, which had felt so singular, so immense, suddenly seemed to find its echo in his. The strength went out of her legs. The fight drained from her body. Her anger dissolved into a wave of sorrow so powerful it threatened to pull her under. She sagged against him, and his other arm came around her, pulling her into a clumsy, desperate embrace. She broke down then, weeping into the rough wool of his shirt, her sobs shaking her entire frame. He held her, his own body trembling, his hand stroking her hair in a gesture that was awkward and unsure, yet profoundly comforting. They stood there in the gray light of dawn, two souls clinging to each other, both trembling from wounds too old and deep to name. That night, after a day spent in a quiet, fragile truce, he did not lay his bedroll by the hearth. After she had climbed into the bed, he came and lay down on the mattress beside her, on top of the quilt. The bed was small, and the space between them was negligible. He did not touch her. She did not touch him. But for the first time, in the vast, lonely darkness of the Montana night, neither of them pulled away. The promises of autumn were lies that year. Winter did not creep in with gentle frosts and crisp, golden mornings. It fell upon them like a judgment. One day the sky was a bruised and moody gray, and the next it was a sheet of unrelenting white. The snow came down not in delicate flakes, but in thick, heavy curtains, burying the pale grass, smoothing the sharp edges of the buttes, and shrinking their world until it was nothing more than the four walls of the cabin and the small, wind-scoured patch of ground around it. The wind, which had been a constant companion, changed its voice from a mournful whisper to a raw, incessant scream. They had been careful, but not careful enough. The early arrival of the snows meant their stores were lower than they should be. Eli's face, already etched with the lines of worry and hard work, seemed to carve itself into a deeper, more somber mask. Without a word, the rationing began. The portions of bread Clara sliced each morning grew thinner. The coffee was stretched with roasted chicory root until it was more a bitter memory of coffee than the real thing. The stews she simmered over the fire were thin, the few remaining vegetables and salted meat floating like lonely islands in a sea of broth. Hunger became a quiet, constant ache in the pit of her stomach, a dull counterpoint to the sharp pang of the cold. In the long hours of dwindling daylight, trapped inside by the blowing snow, Clara found an old, unraveled shawl in the bottom of her trunk. The wool was frayed and faded, but it was strong. With a pair of sharpened sticks Eli had smoothed for her, she began to knit. Her fingers, at first clumsy and stiff with cold, slowly remembered the rhythm. The click-clack of the needles was a small, comforting sound against the howl of the wind. She worked the old wool into a pair of thick, warm gloves. It was a practical task, a way to fight back against the cold that sought to invade every crack and corner of their small home. But it was more than that. As she worked, she pictured Eli's hands, the knuckles split and calloused, the skin chapped raw by the wind and work. The gloves were a prayer, a silent offering of warmth and care. When she finished, she left them on the table by his plate one morning. He saw them, picked one up, and turned it over in his large hand. He flexed his fingers, a look of quiet surprise on his face. He did not thank her, not with words. Instead, he pulled them on, and the fit was perfect. He wore them every time he went out into the frozen world, and the sight of that faded wool covering his hands filled Clara with a strange and powerful sense of purpose. She had made something useful. She had provided a comfort. The real test came a week later. The wind rose to a deafening shriek, and the snow became a solid, impenetrable wall of white. The world outside the window vanished. It was a blizzard, a white monster that clawed at the logs of the cabin and rattled the door in its frame. For 4 days they were prisoners, their world reduced to the single, fire-lit room. The relentless, deafening noise of the storm frayed their nerves, and the forced inactivity made them restless. Eli, a man whose entire life was motion and work, seemed to struggle the most. He paced the small floor like a caged animal before turning his restless energy to the woodpile. He had a store of logs inside, but he began splitting them into smaller and smaller pieces, as if the physical act of swinging the axe was the only thing keeping him sane. He worked until sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill in the cabin, his breath coming in short, harsh bursts. He did not stop until the pile of kindling was high and his hands were a mess of blisters and bleeding splinters. He came to the fire to warm them, his face grim with pain. Clara took a clean cloth and the small tin of salve she possessed and went to him. "Let me," she said softly. He hesitated for a moment before extending his hands. She knelt before him, taking his large, damaged palm into her own. She cleaned the wounds with a gentle touch, her fingers light as she applied the soothing salve. He watched her, his expression unreadable, his gray eyes dark in the firelight. The silence in the cabin was profound, a small, still pool in the heart of the storm's fury. When she was done, she did not immediately let go. She lifted his palm to her lips and pressed a soft, warm kiss into its center. It was an impulse, an act of tenderness that came from a place deeper than thought. He flinched as if burned, his gaze intensifying. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in that moment, the last of the walls between them seemed to dissolve into dust. The air grew thick, charged with all the unspoken things they had shared, the grief, the hardship, the quiet, growing dependency. He reached out with his other hand, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a touch so gentle it was almost painful. That night, the storm still raging outside, they finally came together. It was not a collision of passion, but a slow, tender exploration, a desperate search for warmth and solace in a world that had gone cold. In the flickering light of the fire, they shed the layers of their loneliness. His touch was hesitant, almost reverent, as if he were holding something infinitely fragile. Her response was a quiet, trembling surrender, a letting go of the fear and shame that had held her captive for so long. It was a slow, aching union of two broken souls, a silent promise that they were no longer alone in the storm. Afterward, as they lay tangled together under the heavy quilt, the reality of what had happened washed over Clara. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her temple. It had been beautiful and tender, but a cold knot of fear was tightening in her chest. She was barren, a fraud. What he had taken was a damaged thing. Perhaps he had only come to her out of pity, out of a loneliness made unbearable by the blizzard. The thought was a shard of ice in her heart. He must have felt the tremor that ran through her, the subtle shift in her breathing. He shifted, pulling her closer against the solid warmth of his chest. He said nothing. He did not ask what was wrong. He simply held her, his arm a secure and heavy weight around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. In his silence, she found a strange reassurance. It was not pity that held her. It was something else, something solid and real. She closed her eyes and, for the first time in a long time, she did not feel entirely alone. A week later, the blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. The sky was a brilliant, aching blue, and the snow lay in immense, sculpted drifts, sparkling under a sun that had no warmth. The silence that fell was deep and profound. While Eli was out checking on the cattle and clearing a path to the barn, Clara set about bringing order back to the cabin. While airing out the bedding, she decided to clean the small set of drawers and a rickety chest that stood against the far wall, a place where Eli kept spare linens and other seldom-used items. In the back of the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of yellowed tablecloths, her fingers brushed against a small, cloth-wrapped parcel. Curious, she lifted it out. It was tied with a simple ribbon. Her fingers fumbled with the knot, and the cloth fell away to reveal what lay within. It was a baby's bonnet. It was exquisitely made, of fine white linen and delicate, hand-stitched lace. A pale yellow ribbon was woven through the eyelets. It was tiny, so small it fit perfectly in the palm of her hand. It was the most beautiful, heartbreaking thing she had ever seen. She knew, with a certainty that made her ache, that this had belonged to the baby girl, the daughter he had lost along with his wife. He had kept it all this time, a tiny, perfect relic of a life that had never had a chance to begin. She carefully folded the cloth back around it, retied the ribbon, and placed it exactly where she had found it, pushing it back into the darkness of the drawer. She never mentioned it. It was his grief to hold, and she would not trespass upon it. A strange sort of peace settled over them in the weeks that followed. The brutal honesty of the winter seemed to strip away all pretense, leaving only the essential. They were two people in a cabin, relying on each other to survive. That was the simple, uncomplicated truth. Eli began to spend his evenings by the fire, not pacing, but carving. He took small blocks of pine wood and, with a sharp pocket knife, began to shape them. At first, he carved animals, a hawk with outstretched wings, a lean-looking coyote, a sturdy, broad-backed bear. He worked with an intense, quiet focus, the soft scrape of his knife the only sound in the room. "It's just to pass the time," he said once, when he caught her watching him. But one evening, she saw that he was carving something different. He was shaping a human figure, a woman. She was standing, her skirts appearing to be caught in a gust of wind, her head turned as if looking out at some distant horizon. Her hair was carved in long, flowing lines, blown back from her face. It was her. He was carving her. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He was seeing her, not as the barren, broken woman she believed herself to be, but as a part of this landscape, a figure of strength with wind-blown hair. Their fragile peace was shattered one afternoon by a frantic pounding on the cabin door. Eli opened it to find their nearest neighbor, Thomas Miller, his face white with panic, his beard frosted with ice. His wife, Sarah, was in labor. He explained, his words tumbling out in a rush. The baby was coming too soon, and the snow was too deep to get her to town, to a doctor. He had seen the smoke from their chimney. He needed help. Clara's heart seized in her chest. Eli looked at her, a question in his eyes. She knew what was being asked of her. She was the only other woman for 10 miles. There was no one else. "I'll get my shawl," she said, her voice sounding thin and distant to her own ears. The scene at the Miller cabin was one of controlled chaos. Sarah, a stout, kind-faced woman Clara had only met once, was in her bed, her face pale with sweat, her knuckles white as she gripped the bedding through another contraction. Thomas was helpless, wringing his hands and pacing the small floor. Clara, moving as if in a dream, pushed him aside and went to the bed. She did not know what to do, but she knew she had to do something. She bathed Sarah's face with a cool cloth, spoke to her in what she hoped were soothing tones, and held her hand, gripping it tightly as the pains racked the poor woman's body. Eli and Thomas kept the fire roaring and a great pot of water boiling on the stove. Hours passed in a blur of pain and prayer, and then, with a final, desperate cry from Sarah and a gush of blood and fluid, the baby was born. It was a boy, small and red and squalling, his angry cry filling the small cabin with the miraculous, life-affirming sound of a new soul entering the world. Eli cut the cord, and Clara cleaned the child as best she could, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold him. She wrapped him in a clean blanket and placed him in his mother's waiting arms. Sarah was crying, tears of joy and relief streaming down her face. Thomas was on his knees by the bed, weeping openly. The small room was filled with a joy so pure and so profound it was almost suffocating. And in the face of that joy, Clara felt herself breaking apart. The baby's cry was not a miracle to her. It was a knife, twisting in the empty, hollow place inside her. This raw and beautiful moment was the one thing in the world she would never know. The room began to spin. The happy, tear-streaked faces of the new parents blurred. A great, roaring sound filled her ears, and she collapsed, sinking into a welcome darkness. She awoke in her own bed, Eli sitting in a chair beside her. The memory of what had happened came rushing back, bringing with it a wave of shame so powerful it was nauseating. The next day, Eli found her standing by the window, staring out at the snow-covered fields without seeing them. The Millers had a cradle, an old one that Thomas had made, and the image of it was burned into her mind. She had stood over it for a moment before they left, looking at the sleeping infant, a perfect, tiny creature, and she had felt a desolation so complete it had almost stolen her breath. "Clara," Eli's voice was gentle. She did not turn. "I saw them," she whispered. "Sarah and Thomas, the way they looked at their son, the way she held him." Her voice broke. "I feel like I'm only half a woman. I can do the work. I can mend and cook. But the one thing, the most important thing, I am empty." He was silent for a long moment. She expected him to say nothing, to retreat back into the quiet that was his refuge. But then he moved to stand behind her. He did not touch her, but she could feel the warmth and solidity of his presence. His voice, when he spoke, was low and rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Half a woman?" he said, his voice incredulous. "Clara, when you came here, I was a ghost in this house. This place was just a shelter from the wind, not a home. I was just waiting for the end. Then you came." He took a deep breath. "You carried me through a storm I didn't even know I was drowning in. You fed me with empty shelves and kept me warm with gloves made from nothing. You loved me when I didn't ask for it, when I didn't think I deserved it." He finally put his hands on her shoulders, turning her to face him. His gray eyes were blazing with a fierce, protective light. "You are not half a woman. You're the whole damn world to me." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, shattering the last of her defenses. He saw her. He truly saw her. Not for what she lacked, but for what she was. His love was not a consolation prize. It was a choice, a fierce, deliberate choice. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of a painful, profound, and overwhelming gratitude. He pulled her into his arms, and she held on to him, burying her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of pine and wood smoke and him. Their love was not a simple, easy thing. It was born of winter and hardship, of shared sorrows and quiet understanding. It was a bittersweet, aching love, but it was theirs. And in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness, it was more than enough. The thaw came not as a gentle awakening, but as a messy, reluctant retreat. Winter fought for every inch of ground, its icy grip yielding slowly to a sun that seemed to gain a little more strength each day. The world began to drip. Water trickled from the eaves of the cabin, ran in muddy rivulets across the hard-packed earth, and the great silent plains of snow receded, revealing the pale, flattened grass beneath. The air, for so long sharp and sterile, began to fill with the rich, damp scent of thawing soil, a smell of life returning. For Clara, the change was a release. The confinement of the cabin had been a sanctuary during the storm, but now she felt a desperate need for open air, for the touch of the earth. She found a packet of wildflower seeds tucked away in her trunk, purchased on a whim long ago in a world that no longer existed. In the protected patch of ground by the porch, the same patch she had once tried to turn with a rusty spade. She knelt and worked the soil with her bare hands, breaking up the cold clods until the earth was dark and fine. She planted the seeds with a care that was almost reverent, a quiet act of faith in the future. She was putting down roots, not just for the flowers, but for herself. Eli, too, seemed to feel the pull of this new season of creation. One morning, he began hauling logs from the small stand of pine in the gully a mile from the cabin. When she asked him what he was doing, he looked at the small, one-room cabin, then back at her, a strange, almost shy look in his eyes. "Getting crowded," was all he said. He began to build, laying the foundations for a new room, an expansion that would double the size of their small home. He worked with the same steady, relentless pace he applied to everything, his axe and saw creating a new rhythm on the ranch, a sound of construction, of building a life. Every log he notched and placed was a silent testament to his words from the heart of winter. He was not just making a home for her, he was making it bigger for her. Their life took on a new shape, a shared domesticity that was both comfortable and charged with a quiet, simmering intimacy. The harsh winter had bonded them in ways that words never could, forging a connection in the crucible of survival. They moved around each other in the small space with an easy, practiced grace, their days a quiet dance of shared chores and mutual reliance. One afternoon in late May, a wagon appeared on the horizon, a rare and startling sight. It belonged to a traveling preacher, a man named Josiah Gable, who journeyed through the territory tending to the scattered and isolated flocks of the faithful. With him was his wife, a small, bird-like woman with pale, restless eyes and a smile that seemed permanently fixed to her face. They were on their way to Dry Willow and asked if they might take supper and rest their horses for the night. Hospitality was a sacred duty on the plains, and Clara, with a flutter of nervous energy, set about preparing a meal. It felt strange and momentous to be hosting guests, to be playing the part of a wife for someone other than Eli. She made a stew, thicker and richer than their winter fare, with a rabbit Eli had snared. And she baked a fresh loaf of bread that filled the cabin with its warm, wholesome scent. Mrs. Gable was effusively, almost suffocatingly, sweet. She followed Clara around the cabin, exclaiming over the neatness of the shelves, the sturdiness of Eli's new construction, and the pretty, though worn, pattern of her dress. "You have made such a lovely, cozy home here, my dear," she chirped, her hands fluttering like captured moths. A true testament to a woman's civilizing touch in this wild land. "Your husband is a fortunate man." Clara, unused to such praise, could only murmur her thanks, a blush warming her cheeks. At supper, Reverend Gable, a solemn man with a deep, resonant voice, spoke of scripture and redemption, his eyes often settling on Clara with a kindly, pastoral concern. It was all very pleasant, very proper. But underneath the sweet talk and scripture, Clara felt a strange, unsettling current, a sense of being scrutinized, weighed, and measured. After the meal, while Eli and the Reverend were outside seeing to the horses, Clara cleared the table. Mrs. Gable insisted on helping, her smile never wavering. "It must be so lonely for you out here, dear," she said, her voice dropping to a confidential tone. "So far from, well, from everything you must have been accustomed to." The question was a subtle probe, a delicate insertion of a knife. Clara felt a flicker of her old defensiveness. "I am not lonely," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "My husband is good company." "Oh, of course, Mrs. Gable said quickly. "A strong, silent man, very dependable, I am sure. Still, a woman needs the company of other women, does she not? Someone who understands her more delicate sensibilities." Later that evening, as Clara was fetching a bucket of water from the well, she passed by the open window of the main room. The Gables were inside, believing themselves to be alone. She heard Mrs. Gable's voice, no longer sweet and chirping, but sharp and acidic, a nasty, whetted edge to it. "Can you believe it? Josiah? That is the one, the Penhaligon girl from St. Louis. Beatrice Albright told me the entire story when she passed through Fort Benton. An absolute scandal. Barren, you know, some sickness after a fall. Her fiancé, a very important man, cast her off, rightfully so, of course, and now she is out here, with him. It is a mercy, I suppose, that a man like that would take her. But one does wonder what sort of woman would travel halfway across the country under such circumstances." Clara froze, the wooden bucket slipping from her numb fingers and clattering to the ground. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. The shame she thought she had begun to bury, the disgrace she believed she had left 1,000 miles behind her, was here. It had followed her into her home, delivered with a pious smile and a sweet voice. She was not Clara Carver, a rancher's wife building a life. She was still the Penhaligon girl, the barren one, the scandal. She was unclean. She fled, stumbling away from the cabin, from the poison of those words, her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not stop until she reached the barn, where she collapsed in the hay, the rough straw scratching at her cheeks as she sobbed, silent, racking sobs that tore at her throat. Eli deserved better. He deserved a wife with a clean name, a woman who did not bring whispers and judgment to his door. He was building a home for her, and she was filling it with her own filth. The old, familiar impulse rose up in her, stronger than ever. She had to leave. It was the only honorable thing to do. She waited until the Gables had left the next morning, their wagon a small, receding speck on the horizon. She waited until Eli had gone out to the far pasture. Then, for the second time, she packed her small satchel. She moved like a ghost, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. This time it was harder. She was not just leaving a stranger. She was leaving the only man who had ever looked at her and seen a whole person. She was leaving the man who was her home. She had just finished, her hand on the satchel, when the cabin door opened. Eli stood there, his face grim. He must have seen the Gables' departure as an omen, must have known what their visit would do to her. His gaze fell on the satchel, and a look of profound weariness crossed his features. He did not move to stop her, did not touch her. He just stood there, blocking the only way out. "Don't," he said, his voice low and rough. "I have to," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "You heard her. You must have. I am a scandal. Eli, I bring you nothing but shame. You deserve someone clean, someone whole." He took a step into the room, then another, until he was standing right in front of her. He reached out and took the satchel from her hand, setting it on the floor. Then he took her hands in his. "I had a home," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "It was a place of ghosts, a place of silence and sorrow. I was a ghost in it. Then you came. You argued with the silence. You fought the ghosts. You made it warm again." He looked around the small room, at the flowers on the windowsill, at the neat stack of mended shirts, at the new logs of the unfinished room. "This is not just a place. Clara, you are not just a person in my home." He met her eyes, his own gaze fierce and unwavering. "You're my home now." His words were an anchor, holding her fast against the tide of her own despair. But the poison of Mrs. Gables' gossip had already been released into the world. It spread through Dry Willow like a prairie fire, leaping from person to person, twisting and mutating with each telling. Clara Jane Rowe was not just the barren woman from St. Louis. She was a fallen woman, a woman of loose morals, a whore. The story was juicier that way, more satisfying to the grim, righteous sensibilities of the town. The whispers became an open confrontation a week later. Sheriff Brody, a big man with a drooping mustache and a weary expression, rode out to the ranch. He was not a malicious man, but he was a man who valued order above all else, and the talk about Eli Carver's new wife was becoming a disruption. He found Eli splitting logs by the side of the new construction. Clara watched from the cabin window, her heart a cold, tight knot. The sheriff dismounted, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "Carver," he said, his voice carrying on the clear spring air. "Gotta talk to you." Eli did not stop his work. He swung the axe, splitting a log with a clean, sharp crack. "Then talk," he said without looking up. "It's about the woman," the sheriff said, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "The town's in an uproar. Stories coming out of St. Louis. Nasty stories. Folks are saying she ain't a respectable woman. They're saying your marriage ain't proper." Eli swung the axe again. "Crack!" The sheriff sighed. "Look, I ain't here to judge, but folks are looking to me to keep this town decent. There's talk of annulment, a mail-order arrangement like this. With what's come to light, it wouldn't be hard. It would quiet things down, for everyone's sake." Eli finally stopped. He slowly lowered the axe and turned to face the sheriff. He was not a big man like Brody, but he was lean and hard. And in that moment, he seemed to possess a stillness that was far more intimidating than any amount of bluster. His face was a mask of cold fury, his gray eyes flat and dangerous. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it was as cold and sharp as a shard of winter ice. "I built this home for her," he said, his gaze flicking to the cabin, then back to the sheriff. "Try and take it." It was not a request. It was not an argument. It was a statement of fact and a promise. Sheriff Brody held his gaze for a long moment, the bluster draining out of him. He saw the truth in Eli's eyes. This quiet, solitary rancher would die on this piece of land before he let anyone touch his wife. The sheriff gave a short, defeated nod, turned without another word, and rode away. He had backed down, but the town had not. The following Sunday, Eli hitched the horses to the buckboard. "We're going to church," he said. Clara stared at him in horror. "No, Eli, we can't." "We can," he said, his jaw set. The walk into the small, clapboard church was the longest of Clara's life. Every eye was on them. The polite nods they might have once received were absent. The air was thick with a cold, suffocating judgment. As they walked down the aisle, a space cleared around them as if they were carrying a contagion. They sat alone in a pew near the front, an invisible wall separating them from the rest of the congregation. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the plain wooden cross at the front of the church, her back straight, her hands clenched in her lap, feeling the heat of 100 hostile stares. She thought she would never be able to endure it again. But the next Sunday, Eli hitched the horses, and they went back. This time, Clara held her head high. She met the stares with a calm she did not feel, her expression a careful, neutral mask. Eli walked beside her, a solid, unshakable presence. They sat in the same empty pew, a silent, defiant island in a sea of condemnation. A few days later, Clara opened the cabin door in the morning to find a small basket on the porch. Inside were a half-dozen fresh eggs and a small, cloth-wrapped loaf of still-warm bread. There was no note, no sign of who had left it. She looked out across the empty plains, but there was no one. She brought the basket inside and showed it to Eli. He looked at it, then at her, and a slow, small smile touched his lips for the first time in weeks. Not everyone believed the whispers. Somewhere in the harsh judgment of the town, a quiet seed of solidarity had been planted. That night, unable to sleep, Clara once again turned to her journal, but the words would not come. Instead, she took out a fresh sheet of paper. "Dearest Eleanor," she wrote. It was a letter to her sister, the one who had quietly turned her back on Clara after the scandal, offering no words of comfort, only a frightened, disapproving silence. Clara's pen flew across the page, pouring out all the pain, the loneliness, the fear. She wrote of Eli, of the life they were building, of the cruelty of the world and the unexpected kindness of a single man. The letter was a plea, a desperate cry for understanding, a request for the forgiveness she felt she would never receive. She wrote until the candle burned low, her hand aching. She read it over once, the words blurring through her tears. Then, with a steady hand, she took the letter to the hearth and held it to the glowing embers of the fire. She watched as the edges curled and blackened, as the words of her heart turned to gray, weightless ash. Eli found her there, kneeling by the cold hearth, tears streaming down her face. He sat on the floor beside her, saying nothing, simply waiting. "It was a letter to my sister," she finally whispered, her voice thick with unshed grief. "I was begging her to forgive me, for a shame that wasn't mine, for a forgiveness she will never give." He listened, his expression softening. He reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. Then he leaned in and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. "We're enough," he said, his voice a low, comforting murmur against her skin. "Just us." The hope that had bloomed with the spring wildflowers was a fragile thing, and it withered under the relentless, brassy glare of the summer sun. The sky, which had been a tender blue, bleached to a pale, hazy white, day after day. It remained empty, cloudless, and cruel. The rains did not come. The land grew thirsty, then desperate. The rich, dark soil that Clara had nurtured by the porch turned to pale dust, and the wildflowers, her small symbols of hope, curled in on themselves, their bright colors fading to a brittle, uniform brown. The drought settled over the plains like a suffocating blanket. The creek that cut through their property dwindled to a sluggish, muddy trickle, then disappeared entirely, leaving a cracked serpentine scar on the land. The grass turned from green to gold to a lifeless, dusty gray. The cattle, their ribs beginning to show, grew listless, their heads hanging low as they searched for non-existent patches of green. The small crop of hay Eli had planted for winter feed failed, the stalks turning yellow and thin before they could mature. Eli fought the drought with a grim, silent determination. He dug the well deeper, his body slick with sweat as he worked under the punishing sun. He rode for miles in search of better grazing, only to find the same parched, unforgiving landscape everywhere he looked. He grew thinner, the muscles in his back and shoulders standing out in sharp relief, and he grew quieter. But it was a different silence than before. His old quiet had been one of grief and solitude. This new silence was jagged, angry, born of a helplessness that gnawed at his soul. He was a man of the land, and the land was betraying him. Clara fought alongside him. She watched the garden she had so carefully tended turn to dust, and then she turned her attention to what she could control. She learned to make their dwindling supplies stretch in ways she never thought possible, but it was not enough. The cattle grew sick, their breathing shallow, their eyes dull. They needed medicine, and they needed grain to supplement the scorched pasture, and for that, they needed money they did not have. One evening, after watching Eli stare out at the dying land, his face a mask of despair, Clara went to her trunk. At the very bottom, wrapped in a swatch of velvet, were the last remnants of her former life. A pair of small pearl earrings her mother had given her, a delicate silver locket, and a fine gold chain from Arthur, which she had never had the heart to throw away. They were ghosts, trinkets from a world of privilege and comfort that seemed like a fever dream. Without a moment's hesitation, she wrapped them back in the velvet. The next time Eli rode to Dry Willow for the mail, she pressed the small parcel into his hand. "Sell them," she said, her voice firm. "For medicine, for grain. They are no use to me here." He looked from the parcel to her face, his eyes searching hers. He started to protest, to refuse her sacrifice, but he saw the resolve in her expression. He saw that they were partners in this, that her past was now a resource for their shared future. He closed his hand around the velvet and gave a single, solemn nod. The money from the jewelry bought them a few weeks, a small reprieve, but it could not make the rain fall. The anger and frustration in Eli coiled tighter and tighter. A spring wound to its breaking point. The breaking came one evening at dusk. He had just finished repairing a section of fence, his movements jerky and violent. As he drove the last staple home, he turned and stared at the vast, empty sky as if it were a personal enemy. With a raw cry that was torn from the very depths of his soul, he slammed his fist into the thick, unyielding fence post. The sound of bone cracking was sickeningly loud in the still evening air. Clara, who had been watching from the porch, ran to him. He was cradling his right hand against his chest, his face pale, his teeth clenched against the pain. His knuckles were a bloody, mangled mess, and his hand was already beginning to swell, the bones clearly broken and displaced. "Come inside," she said, her voice calm and steady, belying the frantic beating of her heart. She led him into the cabin and sat him at the table. She fetched the whiskey bottle, a basin of water, and clean strips of linen. She poured him a glass. "Drink this." He did, downing the fiery liquid in one gulp. She gently took his injured hand. It was a ruin. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice soft but firm. He nodded, his jaw tight. With a deep breath, she began the grim work of setting the bones, her touch surprisingly sure and gentle. He did not cry out, but a low groan escaped his lips, and sweat beaded on his forehead. She worked quickly, her focus absolute, binding the hand tightly with splints made from firewood and strips of linen. When she was finished, he slumped in the chair, his face ashen, the whiskey and the pain making him dizzy. He looked at his bandaged, useless hand, then at her. His eyes filled with a fresh despair. He was a rancher with one hand, facing a drought that was killing his herd. He looked utterly defeated. Clara knelt before him and took his good hand in hers. She looked into his eyes, and he saw not pity, but an unshakable strength. "You have been strong for me since the day I arrived," she said, her voice low and clear. "You have carried my burdens and fought my battles. Let me be strong now. Let me carry you." The role reversal was complete. She was no longer the fragile woman in need of his protection. She was his partner, and in that moment, she was the rock he needed to anchor himself against the storm. Their strength was tested again a week later. They lost their first calf. It was a young one, born in the spring, and it had never stood a chance against the heat and the hunger. They found it lying by the dry creek bed, its mother standing over it, nudging the small, still body with her nose in a heartbreaking, futile display. They buried it on a small rise overlooking the cabin. The ground was as hard as iron, and Eli, his broken hand making him clumsy, struggled with the shovel. Clara helped, scooping the loose dirt away with her hands until they had a grave deep enough. They wrapped the small body in a piece of sackcloth and laid it in the earth. As Eli filled the hole, the sound of the dry dirt hitting the cloth was hollow and final. Clara stood by the small mound of earth, and the tears she had held back finally fell. She cried not just for the calf, but for the hopelessness of their struggle, for the fragility of life, for the endless aching sorrow of things that could not be. Eli came to stand behind her, his good arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her head, holding her tightly as she wept, the two of them standing together as a single, lonely silhouette against the vast, indifferent sky. It was in this atmosphere of quiet desperation that the banker arrived. He rode up one afternoon in a smart, black buggy, a vehicle of startling elegance in their dusty, impoverished world. He was a man named Abernathy, from the bank in Dry Willow, a stout, florid man dressed in a fine wool suit despite the oppressive heat. He carried a leather satchel and an air of immense, unassailable authority. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He spread a sheaf of papers on their small kitchen table. "Mr. Carver," he began, his voice smooth and devoid of any warmth. "The bank holds the note on this property. I am sure you are aware. I am also sure you are aware that you are 3 seasons in arrears on your land taxes. The county is demanding payment. As your creditor, the bank must insist that you settle this debt immediately." Eli stared at the papers, his face grim. "There is a drought, Mr. Abernathy. I have lost crops. My cattle are sick." "The drought is unfortunate for everyone," the banker said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "It does not, however, negate your financial obligations. You have 30 days to remit the full amount. If you fail to do so, the bank will have no choice but to initiate foreclosure proceedings and seize the property." 30 days. The words hung in the air, a death sentence for their home. The amount he named was impossibly large, a figure they could not hope to raise in a year, let alone a month. Clara looked at Eli's face and saw the blood drain from it, leaving him looking pale and old. He looked at his broken hand, at the parched earth outside the window, and for the first time, she saw true despair in his eyes. That night, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the cabin. Eli sat by the cold hearth, staring into nothing. Clara watched him, her mind racing. They were going to lose everything. The home he had built, the life they had just begun to forge together. She thought of the banker, of the world of contracts and money he represented. And then, she thought of another world, her old world, a world where a name meant something. "I will go to town," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. Eli looked up, his expression blank. "For what? There is nothing there for us." "I will speak to Mr. Abernathy," she said, her resolve hardening with every word. "He does not know me. He sees me only as a rancher's wife. He does not know my family name." The color rushed back into Eli's face, a dark, angry flush. "No," he said, his voice a low growl. "Absolutely not. I will not have you go begging to that man, using that name. That life is over." "It is not begging," she countered, her voice rising to meet his. "It is leverage. The Penhaligon name carries weight in financial circles. Even out here, they have connections. He would not be so quick to foreclose on a property connected to that family. It might buy us time. Time for the rains to come." "I forbid it," he said, standing up, his good hand clenched into a fist. "I would rather lose this place than have you humble yourself like that. I will not have him looking at you." There was something in the way he said it, a protective fury, that told her he had seen the way the banker's eyes had lingered on her. "You would rather lose our home?" she cried, her own anger flaring. "Out of pride? This is not about your pride, Eli. It is about our survival." He stared at her, his jaw set like granite. "I said no." The next morning, while he was out on the far pasture, his back to the cabin, Clara put on her best dress, the one she had arrived in. It was worn and faded, but it was the most respectable thing she owned. She pinned up her hair, took a deep breath, and hitched the remaining horse to the buckboard. She went anyway. The bank in Dry Willow was a cool, dark, and intimidating place, smelling of old paper and polished wood. Mr. Abernathy looked up in surprise as she entered. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face as he gestured for her to sit. "Mrs. Carver," he said, his voice unctuous. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Clara sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She summoned an image of her mother, of the calm, unshakable poise she had always projected. "Mr. Abernathy," she began, her voice cool and even. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding regarding my husband's property. You see, before I was Mrs. Carver, I was Miss Rowe, Clara Jane Rowe. My mother's maiden name was Penhaligon." She saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. The Penhaligons of St. Louis were not just wealthy. They were powerful. Their banking and shipping interests were known throughout the country. "I am in communication with my uncle, who oversees the family's financial concerns," she lied, her heart pounding. "He is, of course, very interested in our new life here, and is considering a significant investment in the territory. It would be unfortunate if his first impression of the local financial institutions was one of inflexibility in the face of a temporary, climate-related difficulty." Abernathy's smile faltered. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes moving over her with a new, speculative interest. It was a greasy, lecherous gaze, a look that stripped her down and appraised her like livestock. She forced herself not to flinch, to meet his eyes with a calm and unwavering stare. This was the price. She had to endure this. Of course," he said, his tone shifting. "We are always eager to be flexible with valued clients. Perhaps an extension could be arranged, a deferment of the tax payment until the next season, contingent on the drought breaking. Of course." She had won. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made her dizzy washed over her. She concluded the business with a cool nod, stood up, and walked out of the bank without a backward glance, the feeling of the banker's eyes on her back like a physical touch. She held herself together all the way back to the ranch. It was only when she had unhitched the horse and climbed the ladder to the hayloft, their private sanctuary, that the facade finally cracked. She sank into the soft, sweet-smelling hay and broke down, the humiliation and the terror of the ordeal overwhelming her. She did not know how long she had been crying when she felt a presence. Eli was standing at the top of the ladder, his face etched with worry. He came and sat beside her, pulling her into his arms. She expected anger, a lecture for her disobedience. Instead, he just held her, stroking her hair. "He gave us an extension," she sobbed into his shirt. "Until next season." He held her tighter, his body trembling slightly. He cradled her in the hayloft, the late afternoon sun slanting through the gaps in the boards. illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He kissed the top of her head, his voice a low, ragged whisper in her ear. "You saved our home." A few nights later, they were awakened by a frantic orange glow on the horizon and the distant sound of shouting. A fire! Eli was dressed and out the door in a heartbeat. The glow was coming from the direction of the miller's farm. When they arrived, the scene was one of chaos. The miller's barn was engulfed in flames, a roaring inferno that lit up the night sky. Thomas was trying to get the terrified livestock out, while Sarah stood nearby with the baby, her face a mask of horror. Without hesitation, Eli plunged into the smoke and chaos to help. Clara's heart was in her throat as she watched him disappear into the swirling embers, his silhouette a dark shape against the raging fire. He emerged moments later, leading a frightened milk cow, his face black with soot, before turning to go back in. He worked alongside Thomas and the few other neighbors who had arrived, battling the blaze, risking their lives to save what they could. By dawn, the fire was out, the barn a smoldering, blackened ruin, but the house and the animals had been saved. Eli stumbled back to her, exhausted, his shirt singed, his arms and face peppered with angry red burns. She led him home and, for the second time, she tended to his wounds, cleaning the soot from his skin and applying a soothing salve to his burns. He was reckless and brave, and she had never loved him more. As she gently wrapped a linen bandage around a burn on his forearm, a wave of raw, unfiltered emotion washed over her. The sight of the fire, the fear of losing him, had stripped away her last reserve. "I would have given you a child if I could," she said, her voice thick and trembling. It was the deepest, most painful truth of her heart, a sorrow that she would always carry. "A son to help you with the fences, a daughter to watch the wildflowers grow." He looked at her, his smoke-stung eyes clear and serious. He reached out with his uninjured hand and cupped her cheek, his touch gentle. "You already gave me a life," he responded, his voice raw with sincerity. "This one, right here, you gave it back to me." The drought broke in late August, not with a gentle, forgiving shower, but with a violent, dramatic thunderstorm that seemed to tear the sky in two. Lightning spider-webbed across the horizon, and the rain came down in hard, driving sheets, turning the dust to mud and washing the world clean. It was as if the land itself, after a long and agonizing fever, had finally broken. In the days that followed, a miraculous fuzz of green began to appear on the plains, and the air, for the first time in months, felt clean and full of promise. The world was breathing again, and so were they. It was during this fragile, hopeful interlude that the letter arrived. The mail rider, a wiry young man who passed through their corner of the territory once a month, handed a single, thin envelope to Eli. It was addressed to Mrs. Clara Carver. The sight of her new name, written in a fine, elegant hand she knew as well as her own, made her heart stop for a beat. It was from her sister, Eleanor. Her hands trembled as she took it. She waited until the rider was a distant speck on the horizon before she broke the seal. Eli stood by the porch rail, his face unreadable, giving her the privacy to face this ghost from her past alone. The letter was short, the paper smudged in several places, as if by tears. "Dearest Clara," it began. "I do not know if this letter will even find you. I pray that it does. There is not a day that has gone by that I have not thought of you, and of my own unforgivable weakness. I was a coward. Clara, I let Papa's anger and the whispers of others frighten me into silence when you needed me most. I have carried the shame of that silence like a stone in my heart. I have heard stories, rumors that have traveled west, of the hardships you have faced. I know that I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I must ask for it all the same. My husband passed from influenza last winter, and I find myself adrift. I want to see you. I need to see you. I have a son now. Daniel, he is 6 years old. He is all I have left of a man I loved. We are in Helena, visiting my late husband's cousin. It is not so very far. Please, Clara, let me come. Let me look upon my sister's face again. Your loving sister, Eleanor." Clara read the letter 3 times, the words blurring, the ink swimming before her eyes. Forgiveness. It was a word she had yearned for, a word she had tried to burn away in the fire, and now, here it was, offered freely. But with it came a request that filled her with a profound and terrifying dread. "Let me come." She pictured Eleanor, with her fine clothes and society manners, stepping into their rough-hewn, unfinished cabin. She pictured a child, a little boy, running through the rooms where the ghosts of another child still lingered. She saw her past, the world of shame and judgment she had fought so hard to escape, riding up to their door in a buggy. The peace they had built here was a delicate thing, a nest woven from threads of shared hardship and quiet understanding. It felt too fragile to withstand the arrival of the outside world, especially a world that knew the worst of her. She gave the letter to Eli. He read it slowly, his brow furrowed. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back to her. He looked at her, his gray eyes steady and clear. "This is your family, Clara," he said, his voice quiet. "This is your choice." In his simple words, she found her answer. He was not afraid. He trusted her. He trusted them. And so, with a hand that still trembled, she wrote back, "You are welcome in our home." The 2 weeks of waiting were a special kind of agony. Clara cleaned the cabin until it shone, her hands raw from lye soap. She baked and cooked, trying to fill the larder with a semblance of plenty. She was not just preparing for guests. She was preparing for a judgment, a final verdict on the life she had made. Eleanor arrived in a hired wagon, looking smaller and more tired than Clara remembered. The fine clothes were gone, replaced by a simple, practical dress of dark wool. Grief had softened the sharp, judgmental lines of her face, and behind her skirts, clutching her hand, was a small boy with wide, curious blue eyes and a thatch of sandy brown hair. Daniel. The reunion was stiff and awkward, a chasm of unspoken years and hurt separating the 2 sisters. They spoke of the weather, of the journey, their words brittle and polite. Daniel remained silent, his gaze moving from the rough log walls of the cabin to the tall, quiet man who was his new uncle. The thaw began, unexpectedly, with Eli. He did not try to force a conversation with the boy. He simply went about his work, and Daniel, his curiosity overcoming his shyness, began to follow him. He trailed behind Eli to the barn, watching as he mucked out the stalls. He sat on a stump, his small legs dangling, as Eli mended a piece of tack, his bandaged hand still clumsy but his movements sure. One afternoon, Clara came out onto the porch and saw a scene that made her heart ache and heal all at once. Eli was standing in the corral with Bess, their oldest, most gentle mare, and perched on the horse's broad back, his small hands clutching the saddle horn, was Daniel. Eli was leading the horse in a slow, careful circle, his voice a low, steady murmur as he spoke to the boy. "Just feel the way she moves," she heard him say. "She'll take care of you. Just gotta trust her." Clara watched, her hand pressed to her mouth. She saw the look of pure, unadulterated joy on her nephew's face, a wide, toothy grin that transformed him. And she saw the look on Eli's face, a soft, gentle expression she had never seen before. He was a natural father, his patience and quiet strength a perfect balm for a small boy's fears. The sight was a knife in her heart, a sharp, painful reminder of the son she could never place in his arms. But it was also a profound, healing balm. She was seeing a new side of the man she loved, a depth of tenderness she hadn't known existed. He did not need a child of his own blood to have a father's heart. That evening, after Daniel had fallen asleep, exhausted from his adventures, the 2 sisters sat on the porch. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine. For a long time, They sat in silence, the silence of their shared childhood. It was Eleanor who finally broke it. "He is a good man, Clara," she said softly. "Yes," Clara replied. "He is." Eleanor turned to her eyes shining with unshed tears in the twilight. "I was such a fool," she whispered. "I was a coward. I let Papa and the others tell me what to think, but deep down, I never believed the awful things they said." "Not really?" She took a shaky breath. "The truth is, Clara, I think I envied you. You were always the strong one, the one who was not afraid. When you left, it was like you were escaping, and I was still there, trapped in that polite, suffocating world. I am so sorry." In her sister's confession, Clara heard not pity, but a shared pain. She reached out and took Eleanor's hand. "There is nothing to forgive," she said, and for the first time in many years, it felt true. Eleanor and Daniel stayed for a week. When they left, the parting was not stiff and awkward, but warm with the promise of a future. As she watched their wagon disappear, Clara did not feel the pain of her past, but the quiet, steady strength of her present. The change was not only in her heart. Something in the town had shifted as well. Perhaps it was the sight of Eli Carver, bloodied and bruised, defending his wife's honor in the saloon. Perhaps it was his bravery at the miller's fire, or perhaps it was simply the slow, grinding passage of time, which can wear down even the hardest stones of prejudice. The shunning began to recede, not with a formal apology, but in the small, quiet gestures of a community beginning to heal itself. One morning, Sarah Miller's oldest daughter, a girl of about 10, appeared at their door holding a small basket. "Mama said to give you these," she said shyly, holding out a half-dozen brown eggs before turning and running back down the path. A few days later, as Eli was working to replace a rotten post in the corral fence, his neighbor from the south, a grim, solitary man named Henderson, rode up. He dismounted, took a tool from his saddlebag, and began to work alongside Eli, the two men falling into the easy, silent rhythm of shared labor. The whispers had not vanished, but they had been answered by something stronger, quiet acts of neighborly decency. Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. The expansion of the cabin was complete, the new room smelling of fresh-cut pine and possibility. Eli's hand healed, leaving his knuckles thicker but his grip as strong as ever. And one evening, as the sun was setting, casting long, golden fingers of light across the plains, he told Clara to close her eyes. He led her out to the newly finished porch. "You can open them," he said. Hanging from the rafters by two thick, sturdy ropes was a swing. It was beautiful in its simplicity. The seat, a single wide plank of pine, sanded so smooth it felt like silk beneath her fingers. It was a gift of pure, unexpected joy, a piece of her childhood brought here to this wild place. She sat down, and he gave her a gentle push, the swing lifting her in a slow, graceful arc. And then she saw it, carved into the back of the seat, inside a slightly lopsided heart, were their initials, E.C. plus C, J, C, his and hers, her name, now his name. Tears sprang to her eyes. It was the most romantic, most beautiful thing anyone had ever done for her. He sat beside her, and they swung together, gently, back and forth, as the last of the sunlight faded and the first stars began to appear in the vast, purple sky. As the next summer dawned, the land was reborn. The rains had been kind, and the grass grew thick and green. Together, side by side, they worked the patch of earth by the porch. This time, the soil was soft and yielding. They planted rows of beans, squash, and corn. Their hands moved in unison, pressing seeds into the dark, rich earth. They were not just planting a garden. They were planting a future, a life that was growing, together. That night, they lay in their bed in the new room. The wood of the cabin, old and new, creaked softly around them, a comforting, familiar sound. Outside, the wind moved through the tall grass, but it was no longer a mournful howl. It was a gentle whisper, a soft, soothing sigh. The world was vast and wild, but inside these walls, they were safe. They were home. Clara lay with her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. All the pain, all the shame, all the years of feeling like she was not enough had finally quieted. But in the safety of his arms, she felt she could voice the last, lingering shadow of that old fear. "I never thought I would be enough," she whispered to the quiet darkness. He was silent for a moment. Then he shifted, brushing the hair back from her forehead, his calloused fingers impossibly gentle. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, rough murmur, filled with a sincerity that was as solid and real as the land itself. "You were more than I ever dreamed," he replied. "You were my only one. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We encourage you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect with one another. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.